Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are watching from. Tonight, we stand at a crossroads in global politics, witnessing a tectonic shift in trade alliances that few foresaw. A once stalwart partnership seems to be crumbling. India, the fastest-growing major economy, appears to be sending a clear message. We will not be dictated to. India ends trade with America, turning to Russia and China. The headline itself sounds like incendiary diplomacy, but make no mistake, this is not theater. It is strategy, and it demands our full attention. The trade war between India and the United States did not erupt overnight. It has been simmering for years, driven by a clash of interests, divergent priorities, and mounting frustration. At the heart of the crisis lies Washington's decision to punish New Delhi for refusing to toe the Western line on Russia. After the Ukraine conflict, the West expected India, a major democracy and strategic partner, to fall in line with sanctions on Moscow. Instead, India deepened its energy and defense trade with Russia, buying crude oil at discounted rates and maintaining long-standing military cooperation. To the United States, this was nothing short of betrayal. To India, it was pragmatism. A nation of 1.4 billion needs cheap, reliable energy, and no geopolitical sermon will change that reality. The breaking point came when the US imposed punitive tariffs on Indian exports, escalating to an unprecedented 50% on key goods. This was framed as a response to India's unfair ties with Russia, but in truth it was a blunt instrument to bend New Delhi's arm. Washington wanted India to cut its oil imports from Moscow, abandon certain defense procurements, and align more tightly with Western sanctions regimes. But India's response was not to concede, it was to resist. By doing so, it signaled a fundamental shift. India would no longer accept being treated as a junior partner in global politics. The sanctions and tariffs did more than dent trade numbers. They sent a message that the US was willing to weaponize economic interdependence, using access to its market as leverage against political disobedience. For India, this created a dilemma but also an opportunity. On the one hand, American tariffs hit sectors like textiles, pharmaceuticals, and IT services, all crucial for India's economy. On the other, the pressure accelerated India's search for alternative trade partners and reinforced its long-standing doctrine of strategic autonomy. If the US closed one door, India was determined to open two others, with Russia and China waiting eagerly on the other side. It is important to understand why India could not simply abandon Russia to appease Washington. Russia has been India's most reliable defense partner for decades, supplying weapons, fighter jets, and critical technologies that the US often hesitates to share. Beyond defense, the discounted oil Russia provided helped India stabilize its energy markets and keep inflation under control, which was vital for a developing economy. Walking away from that relationship under US pressure would have been seen domestically as surrendering sovereignty, something no Indian government could afford. Thus, the sanctions became a double-edged sword. For Washington, they were supposed to isolate Russia further by cutting off one of its biggest buyers. Instead, they pushed India closer to Moscow. For New Delhi, the tariffs were initially painful, but they highlighted the dangers of relying too heavily on a single trade partner. By seeking greater economic integration with Russia and China, India began not only to cushion the blow but also to redefine its global strategy. What began as a US attempt to discipline a partner has now spiraled into a full-blown trade war. Far from bringing India into line, sanctions have emboldened it. The trigger was economic, but the consequences are geopolitical, shaking the very foundations of how power is distributed in the 21st century. India's concept of strategic autonomy has always been at the core of its foreign policy, and nowhere is it more visible than in its approach to energy security. For a country of over 1.4 billion people, energy is not just a matter of economics, it is a matter of survival, development, and national stability. Rapid urbanization, an expanding middle class, and the demands of industrial growth make India one of the fastest growing energy consumers in the world. This sheer scale of consumption means that no single supplier or region can realistically meet its needs, which is why India has always pursued a diversified strategy. When the United States and its Western allies sought to isolate Russia after the Ukraine conflict, India saw the opportunity not only to secure discounted energy supplies but also to reinforce its commitment to independence in decision-making. Discounted Russian crude became a cornerstone of India's energy strategy. The calculations were pragmatic. Russian oil offered prices significantly below global benchmarks, saving India billions of dollars. These savings were not just numbers on a balance sheet. They meant lower inflation for ordinary citizens, more stable fuel prices for transport and agriculture, and greater fiscal space for the government to invest in infrastructure and welfare. Critics in Washington argued that India was undermining sanctions and giving Moscow a financial lifeline. But from New Delhi's perspective, the question was simpler. Should Indian families pay more at the pump to serve the West's geopolitical agenda, or should India act in its own national interest? The answer was obvious. Strategic autonomy in this context also meant resisting external pressure. American officials repeatedly warned that India's purchases of Russian oil and defense equipment could come at the cost of trade and diplomatic ties with Washington. Yet India calculated that caving to these threats would erode its credibility as an independent power. If it yielded on energy today, what would stop the West from demanding concessions tomorrow on technology, defense, or foreign policy? By holding its ground, India demonstrated that its partnerships are chosen, not imposed. This defiance was not reckless. It was a deliberate assertion of sovereignty in a multipolar world. Energy security is not only about oil. India's diversification strategy includes natural gas imports, coal reserves, nuclear energy, and a strong push toward renewables. But in the short to medium term, crude oil remains the lifeblood of its economy. Russia filled a gap at a crucial moment when global energy prices were volatile and supplies were threatened by geopolitical turmoil. India did not view this as aligning with Moscow's politics, but as seizing an opportunity to keep its economy running smoothly. In the process, it showed that real autonomy is tested not in calm times but in crisis, when the easy option is to follow the crowd. The US tariffs and sanctions attempt to weaponize energy dependence, but India's refusal to back down highlights a broader truth. Strategic autonomy is not a slogan but a policy of resilience. By ensuring energy security through diversified sources, even those frowned upon by Western capitals, India is making it clear that its national interest cannot be subordinated to another country's agenda. This balancing act is risky, but it underscores India's emergence as a power that makes decisions on its own terms, driven by the needs of its people rather than the demands of external actors. India's pivot toward Russia and China represents one of the boldest and most controversial recalibrations in its modern foreign policy. On the surface, it appears to be a natural response to Washington's increasingly aggressive stance, particularly the punitive tariffs and threats of secondary sanctions. But the deeper story is more complex. For India, strengthening ties with Moscow and Beijing is both an opportunity and a gamble, a move that promises economic breathing room and new markets, but also exposes it to risks that could test its long-term strategic autonomy. With Russia, the immediate advantages are clear. The energy trade has been booming, with India buying vast quantities of discounted crude, fertilizers, and coal. This has not only stabilized India's domestic economy, but also fostered closer cooperation in other areas, such as agriculture and defense technology. Moscow, cut off from Western markets, is eager to redirect its exports to willing partners, and India fits the role perfectly. The Agricultural Memorandum of Understanding recently discussed between the two nations underscores this momentum, with both sides looking to expand beyond energy and defense into food security and raw material trade. For India, this means not only cheaper imports, but also new avenues to export its own goods into Russian markets that once relied heavily on European suppliers. China presents a more delicate equation. Despite historic border tensions and geopolitical rivalry, China remains one of India's largest trading partners. The opportunity lies in leveraging Beijing's vast manufacturing base, infrastructure expertise, and role in global supply chains. By expanding trade with China, India can offset some of the losses from US sanctions, especially in consumer goods and industrial inputs. Beijing, meanwhile, benefits from drawing India further away from Washington's orbit, strengthening its narrative of a multipolar world order where the West no longer dominates. For India, pragmatic engagement with China offers short-term gains, but the shadow of unresolved disputes and mistrust lingers, making the partnership more of a necessity than a natural alliance. The rewards of this pivot are undeniable. India diversifies its economic lifelines, reduces vulnerability to Western pressure, and gains leverage in international negotiations. By showing that it can withstand US sanctions by turning eastward, India signals to the world that it is no longer dependent on a single axis of power. This not only bolsters its bargaining position with Washington, but also strengthens its profile as an independent global actor capable of navigating multiple relationships simultaneously. But the risks are equally significant. Growing too reliant on Russia may expose India to future vulnerabilities if Moscow's economy continues to weaken under sanctions, or if Russia demands deeper strategic alignment in return for continued support. With China, the danger is even greater. Increased economic interdependence could embolden Beijing in political and territorial disputes, reducing India's flexibility in defending its national interests. The pivot also risks alienating key Western allies, potentially stalling technology transfers, defense collaborations, and investment flows that have been vital to India's modernization. In essence, India's tilt toward Russia and China is not a wholehearted embrace, but a calculated maneuver born out of necessity. It is a balancing act where every reward carries a price and every new partnership demands vigilance. For now, the strategy provides relief and leverage, but its long-term sustainability will depend on how well India can manage the competing expectations of Moscow, Beijing, and the West while still preserving its cherished independence in global affairs. The relationship between the United States and India has always been a complex mix of cooperation, rivalry, and cautious trust, but in recent years it has entered one of its most turbulent phases. What was once hailed as a strategic partnership built on shared democratic values and common interests in countering China now finds itself strained by economic disputes, clashing foreign policy priorities, and a widening trust deficit. The latest trade crisis is only the visible symptom of deeper tensions that have been building beneath the surface. At the center of the discord is Washington's expectation that India should fall in line with Western sanctions on Russia. From the American perspective, India's continued purchase of Russian oil and defense equipment undermines the global campaign to isolate Moscow. From the Indian perspective, however, this expectation smacks of hypocrisy and double standards. European nations themselves continued to import Russian energy long after the sanctions regime was announced, yet New Delhi is being singled out for punishment. This perceived imbalance has fueled resentment and reinforced India's determination to pursue an independent path, even if it means angering Washington. The decision by the US to impose steep tariffs on Indian exports was seen in New Delhi not just as an economic measure, but as a political message: align with us or face the consequences. The fact that tariffs reached as high as 50% on certain categories of goods sent shockwaves through Indian industry, threatening jobs and export revenues. But more than the economic cost, it was the symbolism that stung. India believed it had earned a position as a trusted partner through cooperation in defense, technology, and intelligence sharing. Being treated instead as a defiant junior partner in need of disciplining has deeply unsettled policymakers in New Delhi. Yet, despite the rhetoric and punitive measures, neither side is prepared to walk away entirely. The US still views India as a critical counterweight to China in the Indo-Pacific, while India values access to American technology, investment, and educational institutions. This uneasy reality has kept the doors open for constructive dialogue, with trade negotiators continuing to meet and discuss potential compromises. The problem is that every conversation comes back to the same sticking point. Washington wants India to scale down its reliance on Russian energy and arms, while India insists its national interests come first. Until this fundamental disagreement is resolved, progress will remain limited and fragile. There is also the issue of trust. For years, Washington and New Delhi built a narrative of convergence, with India seen as an emerging pillar of a new democratic alliance. But as soon as differences on Russia surfaced, that narrative began to crumble. Indians now wonder whether the United States values their country as an equal partner, or simply as a tool in its rivalry with China and Russia. Americans, on the other hand, question whether India can truly be relied upon in moments of geopolitical crisis. This erosion of trust is far more damaging than tariffs or sanctions because it undermines the very foundation of the relationship. The US-India relationship is not breaking apart, but it is certainly being redefined. Both countries still need each other, but the days of easy alignment appear to be over. What emerges from this period of flux will determine whether the partnership matures into one based on genuine respect for autonomy or collapses into another cycle of mistrust and missed opportunities. Friends, the real drama here is not a clash of personalities or tweets. It's about power, choice, dignity. India is telling the world we will not be compelled to choose. We will choose. If the West treats India as a subordinate, it will lose influence. If India surrenders strategic autonomy, it loses its destiny. This is not just a trade war. It is a war for sovereignty. Thank you for listening. As the world watches this unfolding chessboard, we must ask, will India emerge freer, or will it be boxed in? Only time will tell. But tonight we witness the opening gambit.